What's up, YouTube? Welcome to the Wright State University Veteran Voices Project. I am Navy veteran and content manager Jeremy Tkach. On behalf of the Veteran Voices Project, we'd like to thank you for watching this interview and to let you know that the best way to support us, and especially the veterans featured on this channel, is to hit that subscribe button. So go ahead, feel free to smash that subscribe button. Please hit that like button and go ahead and comment and share. Again, thank you for watching this important story. Hope you enjoy.
We're recording the interview of Dr. Jeffrey Johnson. This interview is being conducted by Ericka Carter and Nick Dix from the Wright State University Veterans Voices Project. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University in the New Media Incubator. It is 2:36 p.m. on January 10th, 2019. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Ericka?
I am fantastic. I want to thank you so much for coming out today and spending this time with us.
And thank you for asking. I'm really excited about it.
Okay. When and where were you born?
I was born on 8 December 1954 in Vincennes, Indiana, which is in Knox County.
Okay. Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
My dad was John Andrew Johnson, and he was a soil conservationist, but also a Navy veteran. He was actually a survivor of Pearl Harbor. And my mother is Mary A. Johnson. My father, unfortunately, has passed away. My mom is still living. And Mom has had multiple jobs. She's been a real estate agent, a bank teller, she's been a hairdresser, she's done a lot of things, as well as a mother and a homemaker.
Okay, so you have siblings?
Yes, I have one sister, and her name is Linda, and she lives near Muncie, Indiana as well.
Did she join the military?
No, she did not. But the interesting thing of my sister and I, we were both born on the same day, 4 years apart. So she was born in 8 December 1950, and I was born in 1954.
Okay. Any particular planning by the parents there, or just lucky?
No.
Lucky habits. Okay.
Grace of God.
What were you doing before you entered the service?
Well, that's interesting. I joined the service after I'd been out of college for a few years. And so I was doing personal pharmacy. I was working in some chain stores and hospitals and that kind of thing. And due to some previous experiences and also working for the VA for 5 years, I decided that getting into the Air Force was the way to go. I was part of the Army National Guard as well, and but I just looked a lot better in blue. So I decided to join the Air Force. And at that time when I joined, which was 1992, the Air Force was actually using pharmacists more along the line that I really wanted to see. Because my duty with the Army, we really used pharmacists at that time more as a logistician than a clinician. And one of the reasons I went to pharmacy school was to be a medic and to take care of people. And the Air Force was starting to use pharmacists in that vein. And so no pun intended. And so I went ahead and decided to look at the Air Force, and it really was a good fit for me. Okay. So I did 5 years with the Army, 25 years with the Air Force.
Whew.
Yeah.
I feel like you wrapped up my interview.
Cool. Well, great. It's been a great time. Thanks, Ericka, so very much. Nick, it was nice to have you with us.
Okay, let's go way back.
Okay.
When did you graduate high school?
I graduated high school in 1973.
And that was in Indiana?
It was Paoli High School in Paoli, Indiana. Yep.
Okay. And then you went to college. Where did you go to college?
I did my undergrad at Purdue University in Lafayette, Indiana, and that was from 1973 to 1978. I got a BS in pharmacy at that time. And then after I joined the Air Force in 1997, it just seemed like a good time to try to get an advanced degree. And so while I was stationed at Wright Pat, I got an MBA at Antioch. And after I got that, I decided, probably having a different degree in medical training would be good. And so I went into a doctorate program of naturology and herbology, which is basically natural medicine. So I got a PhD in naturology. And then I decided that, most of my pharmacy brothers and sisters are probably going to think I've got really a bogus degree, so I need to have a PharmD to make it credible. So I went ahead to the University of Kansas. Air Force graciously accepted paying for that and got my PharmD doing a distant learning program. So I did that from 99 to 2003. And so basically I have 2 doctorates.
Okay.
An MBA.
Okay, so we enjoy school.
Yes.
We enjoy school.
We do.
Is where we.
But
where
we have
wanna
to
go.
apply it, because school is okay, but if you don't take that education and use something with it, then that doesn't do much. So I enjoy doing that.
Still gonna take you back because you keep
Okay.
jumping. You just the timeline.
Okay.
All right. So college. When you went into college, you knew you wanted to be a pharmacist. What gave you that drive and passion?
Well, all through high school, I actually worked as a clerk at a local pharmacy, at a chain store pharmacy in Paoli, Indiana. And that really, the individual that I worked with, his name was Skip Lambden, and Skip was really integral in helping me learn what pharmacy was about and what a pharmacist could do. I actually had an aunt, my dad's mother's sister, who was willing to pay for me to go to medical school if I wanted to. And I really didn't want to be a doc, not a medical provider. I really wanted to be a pharmacist because I'm more of a chemical-minded individual, and as pharmacy will always tell you, better living through chemistry, and that's appropriate chemistry, of course. But that's what really got me started, was in high school, is working with Skip and learning what a pharmacist can do.
What can a pharmacist do?
Oh my goodness, kid, a pharmacist can do all kinds of things. We are part of the integrated healthcare team, and what we bring to the fight for the provider, to the doctor, the nurse practitioner, PA, whatever the provider may be, is that understanding of what medications do within the system, both the good and the bad, and being able to provide them that access to that information and giving them recommendations on, say, for example, if you have a certain condition, we would be able to recommend the medications that would be best for you and what medications may not be very effective for you. And then looking at other alternative treatments, which is one reason I went into natural medicines, was to look for, are there other medications besides the chemicals that we could utilize within the patient's care? So that's what a pharmacist can really help bring to that. And we're starting to learn as, see, you're blaming me for jumping ahead, but you're forcing me to do that. But now we look at the pharmacy industry today. One of the things that are changing there, as we become more pharmaceutical care providers, we're starting to learn that there's a whole new world out there that we can recommend to the provider and to the patient to look at. And so there's that triad of the doc, the patient, and the pharmacist that has to work together to result in the best patient care. So that's what we bring to the fight.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that information.
You're very welcome.
I feel so educated. Okay, so good time with Skip. Skip gave you some groundwork
Yes.
of who you are as a person.
Yes.
And then you go off to college because great aunt was willing to pay for it. Now, she was only willing to pay for the
Medical school. So.
and pharmacy school is not.
Yeah, no. So
same?
what I ended up having to do, Ericka, was I ended up working 3 jobs every summer. I worked at the pharmacy. I also worked as a soda jerk at a local hangout, and then I also worked as a grocery clerk. So what was funny was they were all 3 right next to each other. So I would go from the pharmacy to the grocery store to the fast food place. And I had a couple folks that wondered if I didn't have a twin brother, because they would run into me at each place and say, well, didn't I just see you? Oh, no, that's my twin brother. No, you didn't see me.
Okay. A soda jerk.
Yeah.
That was a title. I want to explain this for the children.
Yes, understood.
Okay.
So a soda jerk would be someone, let's say like Dairy Queen, someone that would get you your ice cream or your milkshake or something like that. And so we would be the customer service representative behind the counter that would be taking care of those kind of orders.
And they called it a jerk because of the motion of the
Exactly.
turning off the on.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't want you people thinking you're a jerk. So that's not the case at
Well,
all.
we'll get there later.
We'll get into that. Okay, and you did this for 4 years?
5. Actually, pharmacy school at that time was 5 years. So I
Okay.
did that for five summers.
And you graduated
In 1978.
in
May of
1978.
1978, yeah.
All right. Then what?
So my independent career from the military was somewhat interesting because I worked for chain stores, so I went back to the same store I had worked at for a while, and then they transferred me over to a different store. But I worked within that chain for a few years, worked for independent pharmacies, which are not related to chains. I worked for them for a few years, and then I worked for a hospital pharmacy for a couple years. And then that's when I started getting the wanderlust to get back into the military.
Now, when you say get back into the military, when in this did we join the military the first time, and why?
That's another long story we'll tell you later.
Okay. I need to know now.
No. We'll go on. So,
Okay.
I'm trying to think of my years here.
Okay.
So in 1987, I joined the Army National Guard as a pharmacy officer. I was living in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I was working for the Veterans Administration Hospital as a pharmacist as well, which was really, really a very good connection because the VA represents and understands that if you're a National Guardsman, they allow you to what we call double dip. So if you were working for the VA and you were on National Guard duty, the VA continued to pay you. So that was really a sweet deal. So I did that for 5 years, and then that's when I started really feeling the need to come active duty and get into that. And so that's when as I was sharing with Nick as we were filling out the paperwork, that I did some negotiating with the Air Force recruiter and the Army recruiter, and the Air Force deal was much, much better.
Why?
Well, again, as I said earlier, at that time in 1987, essentially, the Army was looking at pharmacists as logisticians and not clinicians, whereas the Air Force had started to use us as clinicians. As I mentioned earlier, us being able to talk to the providers more directly from a provider-to-provider level and give them recommendations on the patient care. Army hadn't gotten to that point yet. The Air Force was there, and it just, at my point in my pharmaceutical care career, seemed to be the most logical place to be. And so, and as I teasingly say, I didn't have to sleep on the ground anymore, and we didn't march back and forth like we did in the Army and that kind of stuff. And so, I just, yeah, and I do look better in blue. So
Why did? I've seen you in blue. I agree. Why did you join the Army to begin with? What was
now, that's a great story too. So at one point in my pharmacy career, before I got into the Army National Guard, I actually owned my own store for a couple of years. And our banker was an Army National Guardsman. And he was constantly harping on me about, hey, we need pharmacists in the Army Guard, in the Indiana Army Guard. Would you be interested? Da, 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 da. So finally I talked to a recruiter and I joined. And so for the first year, my first year in the Army Guard, I was living south of Indianapolis, which our drill was in Indianapolis. And so I'd have to drive basically 3 hours to get the drill. And I was there all weekend and 3 hours home after. And my wife, my lovely bride of 41 years, who I generally call General Johnson because she'll always outrank me, she said, this is getting old. We need to move to Indianapolis because this driving back and forth stuff is crazy. So we did. We moved to Indianapolis, got a job with the VA, and that really, really worked out well. And so we did that, like I say, about that 5-year period. But again, she recognized that it just seemed to be a natural fit for me to be full-time active duty. And so that's one reason we looked at doing that. But the Army Guard, I really enjoyed my time with the Army Guard. I really did. I learned a lot through that.
When did you meet the general?
Oh my. Well, this is a great story. So I actually met Cindy In 1978, right after I graduated, I was waiting to get my pharmacy license, and so I was working for Hooks, which was the chain store I went to work for. And since I didn't have my license yet, they really couldn't let me practice pharmacy. So during that interim time, they put me on a crew called the Tear Down and Setup Crew. And so I was their pharmacist on that crew, and so we would either go into a store and tear it down because Hooks was moving it, or we would stand up new stores. And so Cindy's store, which was a store in Kokomo, Indiana, was being torn down and being relocated. And so she was actually the cosmetic and candy girl. And so I met her at that store while we were tearing it down. And we started our relationship there. And so the funny part of the story is she ran me off the road. And so anytime I tell someone says, "How did you meet your wife?" I said, "Well, she ran me off the road." And she'll tell you that I embellish, which I just can't believe that I do that. But and I know, thank you for agreeing, Ericka. But yeah, she ran me off the road. That's how I met her. Because I got out of the car and I said, "What's wrong with you?" And she flipped her hair and it just ignored me, which really drove me nuts because, you know, how can you ignore me? And so that kind of got it started. Although I will tell you, it got even better. So we started to get to know one another, and that very first weekend that we spent the weekend visiting with each other, I got home. I lived about 3 hours from her. So I called her and said, "Hey, Cindy, this is Jeff." And she goes, "Jeff who?" Yeah, I said, "The guy that just spent all weekend visiting with you." She, "Oh, yeah, Jeff. Yeah, you. Okay, got it." So 41 years later, she still sometimes says, "Who are you?"
That is so precious. Okay, your banker told you to join the National Guard.
Yeah.
You had to go to basic.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, one of my best stories about basic was we'd been out in the field on maneuvers for a couple of days, and actually it was the first 24 hours, and so we were all pretty haggard. You know, we're second lieutenants, we're not doing well, and we had to call our drill instructors, or drill sergeants, and so I'm standing there in line, and my drill instructor walks up and he says, "Johnson," he says, "you don't look like you're doing very good." And I hadn't slept very well and that kind of thing. He said, "Looks like you need some coffee." I said, "Well, you know, drill instructor, that'd be great. Drill sergeant, that'd be great." He goes, "Well, come with me. I'm going to take you to the front of the line. We're going to get you some coffee." So he pulls me out of line, and he doesn't take me up the line. He takes me outside the tent. And the mess sergeant is standing at the end of the tent. And so we get down there, and my drill sergeant says, "Mess sergeant," he says, "this young lieutenant needs some coffee." He goes, "Really?" He goes, "Well, LT, we'll take care of you. We'll set you up." And so he takes me over to this urn, and as he's pouring the coffee out of the urn, he says, "LT," I said, "I need you to look at something." So he pulls me, after I've got my cup of coffee here, and he pulls me over by this deuce and a half that's sitting by the mess tent. And there's this green garden hose that's running out of the radiator up through the trees and over by the coffee urns. He goes, "Now, as you're drinking then, I want you to think about something." He says, "You're going to think about whether or not I made this coffee with the water out of my radiator, which of course has antifreeze in it. So now you're going to wonder if I made your coffee with antifreeze." He said, "And I'll tell you the secret. The way you know if I made that coffee with antifreeze is tonight when you look down and your belly's glowing green, you'll know that's what it was." So of course, all day long, I'm sitting there thinking, "Oh my God, I've just been poisoned." And so that night I go to bed, and of course my tummy didn't turn green. And so I got up the next morning, didn't sleep a wink, get up the next morning, I'm standing in line again. The mess sergeant sees me, he says, "LT," says, "how'd you sleep last night?" And I said, "Not very well, mess sergeant." He said, "I can tell. You don't look like you sleep. You want some more coffee?" I said, "No." And he said, "Well, let me show you something else." So he pulls me back up there. Well, what they had done is jury-rigged that garden hose so it looked like it was coming out of the radiator. It wasn't even close to it. When you finally got down and looked at it, it was, feet away from it. But you couldn't tell that from glancing. He goes, "Now you'll be able to sleep better tonight." But that's being a lieutenant.
Okay, so you were an officer because of your degree.
Mm-hmm.
So that was automatic.
Yeah, your direct accession they bring in and so I was a second lieutenant, first lieutenant, captain in the Guard. And then when I switched over to the Air Force, I started out as a captain.
Where did you go to OCS?
OCS was down in lovely San Antonio at Camp Sam, Fort Sam. Yeah, yeah.
It's pretty nice down there. Have you been recently?
I have. I was actually stationed at Wilford Hall in San Antonio for 3 years. So yeah, it is nice.
Okay.
You been to Camp Bullis?
I don't think so.
Oh well, if you get a chance, you need to go to Camp Bullis. That's in San Antonio too.
Okay. What year was it when you finished OCS, and how long was OCS?
For us, it was 12 weeks, and that would have been in January of 90. I want to think. No, January of 88 is when, yeah. January of 88 for 12 weeks.
Were you a newlywed then?
Fortunately, I'd already married my lovely bride, and we'd been married a few years. Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, I got to sit here and think about that. We'd been married 5 years at that time, something like that, yeah. So, yes.
Okay, and she was okay with the whole military idea?
Yeah.
What about your parents?
My father very much so, because like I said, he was a World War II vet, and so he was very supportive. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story about him. So when I came home and told him, of course I was married and grown out of the house, but I came home, called him and said, you know, I've joined the Army. And Dad said, he says, whatever possessed you to join the Army? I said, well, Dad, you were in the Navy and you always told me never to join the Navy. And so I joined the Army. He goes, well, Jeff, I would have thought sure you would have figured out you should have joined the Air Force. I said, well, Dad, you didn't say that. He said, well, I figured you were smart enough to figure it out on your own. I said, well, okay. So 5 years later, when I switched to the Air Force, he said, now that's the boy I raised. So Dad was good with it, and then Mom really didn't say much about it. So I'm not sure.
You were an older
I was.
OCS
I was.
attendee.
And that's where I got my nickname Pappy, because I've always been kind of the oldest guy whatever unit I've been in, I've always been one of the older ones. So my nickname, my call sign is Pappy.
Oh, okay. Okay. Go through OCS.
Mhm.
You're already a pharmacist. That is the job that you chose in the
Mhm.
Army, or signed in
Mhm.
as.
Yes.
So did you have to go to any training with the Army? Was there AIT for you?
Not really, no. In fact, that's kind of interesting, because so when I got back to my unit, which I was stationed in Indianapolis, and with them, they hadn't had I was actually the battalion pharmacist, but I was assigned to the head and support company. So I kind of had dual jobs, because on the one hand, some of our other medical companies didn't have pharmacists. I was the only pharmacist in the state. And so we had basically pharmacy technicians running the pharmacies in the other company. But part of my job was to make sure that they were trained and knew what they were doing and that kind of thing. So we had 5 companies attached to the battalion. So not only did I have to run the pharmacy and the head support company, but I had to make sure that my farm techs and the others were doing it correctly. So it was a very interesting job to be able to have that, because the other companies were not stationed in Indianapolis. They were stationed throughout the state. But whenever we went to our 2-week summer camp, all 5 companies would be there, plus they had support. So we'd get an opportunity to do that then.
So you worked a lot harder, as your wife put, than.
Yes. Yes. Then one week in a month and 2 weeks in the summer. Yes.
Okay, so the 5 years go by. I've had enough of that. Wife goes, this is your true calling.
Yeah.
Let's get you where you need to be.
Yes.
The Army deal.
So the Army deal, so as I was sharing with Nick before, when I went to the Air Force basically said, you know, we're going to bring you in as captain. You got to keep your rank. He showed me Wright Pat, said, we're going to station you at Wright Pat. And, you know, basically everything was lined out, and boom, 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 boom.
Showed you Wright Pat.
Yeah, he even brought me to Wright Pat for a visit. I got to interview and talk with the guys that would be my boss, and the NCOs and techs I'd be working with, which was really cool. And so I told him, I said, well, look, it's going to, you know, give me a week, because I need to go talk to the Army. Since I'm Army right now, I need to talk to them and make sure and see if they can match it. He said, okay. So I took the contract, and I went to an Army recruiter. I'll never forget, it was a captain. And I said, look, I said, I'm thinking about joining the Air Force. I said, but I want to give the Army a chance. So he looked at the contract and he said, well, you know, Captain, I can't match this. He said, you know, we're going to have to bring you back in as a first lieutenant. I said, well, that's a non-starter. I've already earned captain. Why do I want to go back and be a first lieutenant? And he said, and I can't guarantee your base. I just can't do that. He said, will you give me at least a little time to see what I can work out? I said, sure. So he calls me the day before I'm going to sign my contract with the Air Force, and he says, I got good news for you. He said, we can bring you in as a major. And I kind of said, how can that be? A week ago it was a first lieutenant, and now you're telling me you're going to bring me in as a major. Something, nah, I don't buy it. He said, oh, no, we'll have it on your contract. I said, nah, I don't see it happening. And he said, I still can't give you your base. And I said, well, you know, the Air Force deal is just too good. I can't pass it up. So I signed it and sent it in, and off we went.
Your years of service, did that go into your pay as a?
It did.
So just went right on over. So now you're an active duty
With
Air Force
yes.
captain, 5 years.
Yes.
Okay. And you
yes.
just packed up and came right across state lines.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Pretty much.
And how is the general feeling about this?
She was pretty cool with that because she knew, well, so what's interesting, if you look at my career as basically a civilian and as an Army pharmacist, about every 3 years I was changing jobs as a civilian pharmacist because I just have this wanderlust in me, and so I would change jobs about every 3 years. And it would always be the same because my first year I loved it, second year it's okay, third year it sucked and I need to go do something else. And so with the Air Force, it worked out really well because they only kept you one place 3 years. So it was perfect. So with the first year I could love it, second year it wasn't so good, third year I'm ready to go. And the Air Force said, you're right, it's time for you to go. And so they would move you someplace else. And she said, you know, this is going to be a perfect fit for you. And it was. It really, really worked out well. So that first tour, actually the first 2 tours, my first tour in Wright Pat, Cindy, General J, stayed at Indianapolis because she had a really good job with Bank One. She was actually an officer, a bank officer, and was doing really, really well. And she had kind of followed me around during all this other time. And I said, you know what? You stay in Indianapolis, and I'll do the traveling this time. So I was at Wright Pat. She was in Indianapolis, and that worked out well because it was only a couple hours, so that wasn't bad. My second job, my second tour, though, was in Alaska. So Cindy stayed in Indiana, and I went to Alaska. And what's really cool about that, though, was my supervisor at the time, Colonel Williamson. He was very understanding, and he actually had a similar situation because his wife lived in the lower 48. And so he would try to find seminars that I could come to and Cindy could meet me at. And so he did that. He was my supervisor for the first 2 years I was there. So for those first 2 years, about every 90 days, he was sending me back down. And that really worked out well. And Cindy came up and we had some phenomenal vacations in Alaska because it's just such beautiful territory. So it was a good duty station. My next duty station from Alaska, I got sent to Oklahoma, and Cindy, again, that wasn't bad. That was about a day's drive. But then when I got shipped to Texas for the first time, Cindy said, you know, it's time for us. Well, and it's interesting. The good Lord works things out. So Bank One at that time had got bought out, or they had merged with Citicorp, and they were phasing Cindy's department out. And so Cindy said, you know, it's time for me to take the golden parachute and get out of here. So we came back together as one household in Texas. So that whole time, and people will say, well, how did you guys stay together? Well, it's the grace of God. It's truly the grace of God, and I know that. So we moved back into the same household in Texas and been together ever since in the same household.
If I can count, this is now year 10 you guys are living together.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Do you think, looking back, that time helped?
In our relationship?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Because I think Cindy would tell you, she had been married before, so I was her second husband. And one of the things she learned about me was because I really met her that year I graduated from college. So my only time of living alone was my time in college. So I think she would tell you that one of the things that she noticed about me was I really didn't know how to live alone. And so for that 10-year period, in essence, the majority of the time I was living alone. And she was okay with it because she had been divorced for 2 years before we started dating. And so she had learned, even though we had 2 children, she had 2 children from her previous marriage, she still had learned how to live alone. And I think that was really good for me because it helped me. And I said, yeah, I think it has. I think it's made us closer because we understand how important our relationship is. And it takes work. I mean, it's just like any relationship. You have to work at it every day.
And you have to communicate.
Sure.
A lot of communication when you
Sure.
live that far apart.
Yep.
For everyday mundane tasks.
Yeah.
I understand. Thank you for that answer.
Welcome.
All right, you get to Texas, everybody's together, big happy family.
Yeah.
And you're stationed, is it back?
It's Shepherd Air Force Base, which at that time I was the chief of pharmacy training, and what that job was I was in charge of the overall training program for our pharmacy technicians, our brand new one, which we call them a 3-level. And also we had an officer training course. So we would bring in pharmacists, lab officers, and nutritional medicine officers for a 2-week, no, actually it was a 3-week, what we call BOMO, which was the biomedical sciences, which was my core, officer management orientation. Because at that time, and it's still true, pharmacy and lab have probably about 60% of any medical group's budget goes through pharmacy and lab. And so we wanted to make sure our young officers had a good basis for understanding management of that big of a resource. And so we would bring in usually captains, and they all now come in as captains. Pharmacists do. But we would bring them in up to their 5th or 6th year. We try to get them there because we figure that's right at that cusp where they're going to be getting into being a major and being more in charge of bigger things. So I was in charge of that for 2 years. Now that was good. That was good duty. And Cindy and I did well.
I have a few questions.
Okay.
Just about how the orientation and structure of the Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
You already had your doctorate. Did these trainees already have their doctorate, or was it just?
When I first got there, no. But it's gotten to the point now where the entry level into pharmacy is you have to have your PharmD anyway. And so now the pharmacists coming in, and that's been over the last 10 years, the pharmacists coming in have their PharmD, so they have their doctorate. So those first couple years, those first year there at Wichita Falls, I didn't have as many PharmDs, whereas the second year I had more, which was one reason, again, I wanted to have my own PharmD, because I thought from a credibility point of view, if I'm talking to a pharmacist who has their PharmD, they're going to be more inclined to concur or listen to what I have to say as if I have the same level of degree they do.
Okay.
Now, that's not to say that a BS pharmacist doesn't have as much, because they do. I know some BS pharmacists that can hold their own very well.
Okay. When you were training, were there any enlisted trainees? Can you explain how that works?
Yes. So with the Air Force, and the Army's similar, but with the Air Force, what we do is after the troop gets through basic, and they're getting ready to go to what the Army would call AIT, what we call AFSC, specialty training. So the Air Force would start out at a 3-level. And so those troops I had, those enlisted troops I had, which were all basically airmen basic, or A1Cs, airmen first class, they're at their first level training. And they're going to...
E2s, E3s?
Yeah, E0 to E2s,
Okay.
yeah. And so they would come out of that, after that, and that was a 12-week course, they would be a basic pharmacy tech. So their ability would be to basically read and interpret prescriptions, fill prescriptions, and do basic patient counseling, which would be what we were responsible to get them trained up for. And that's what their 12 weeks did. And their 12 weeks, basically very similar to your combat medic, because they would go through anatomy and physiology and have some of the basic understandings. But then we would specialize them more into looking at the medications and how that impacts the body. So yeah, that was really good. I enjoyed that a lot, because you're really molding the young airmen to get that. And then from their 3 level, once they get to their base, they continue their education, and then it's correspondence course. But they continue that, and they go from 3 level to 5 level. The next level up would be 7 level, and when they reach 7 level, they're generally going to either be a staff sergeant or a tech sergeant, which is an E5, E6. And at that level, then we would bring them back for another, basically, I'm trying to remember what, it was a 3-week course, but it was more focused on management, because once they reach the E5, E6, they're really getting more into the management level of managing the line and those kind of things. Then from there, once they reach a 7 level, then the next level would be a 9, and the 9 level is generally where you're at the senior NCO level, and that really is truly more management and leadership. Still can work the line. I mean, you can always work the line of dispensing, but as with officers, as you get more senior, then you're really more into the leadership and management side.
So during this time at in Wichita Falls, did you ever teach?
I did. I taught both in the enlisted side, so primarily, and this is kind of interesting, since I had my doctorate in herbology and naturology, we had an herbal medicine component, and so I usually taught that. And then I also did a couple of the classes on specific medications and interactions and those kind of things, and that was a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun with that. And then on the BOMO side, on the officer side, I did a lot of the leadership training as well. Yeah, it's a great question.
How many tornadoes did you have?
Well, it's funny you would ask that. When I'm going to back up to Tinker before I got to Shepherd. So when they had the F5 that came through, I was actually stationed at Tinker. And that was, wow, that was incredible. I was actually on base doing some training that day when the tornado came through, and I was on my way home, and I noticed, well, I'd heard from some of the guys, because the hospital, we were closed, we were done for the day, and so I was walking through, and I was watching the news was still on, and they were saying, hey, this tornado's coming out of Fort Sill, you know, everybody take cover, da 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 da. So I'm going, okay, whatever. And it was sunny out. I mean, it was beautiful outside. And I was like, okay, cool. So I'm driving home, and I look down toward Fort Sill and that area, and Altus, and you could just see this massive black mass coming toward Oklahoma City. And so when I got home, I actually called General Jay and said, hey, I said, we're under a pretty serious tornado threat. So they're warning us to go ahead and get into the bathtub and, you know, just kind of hang close. So I said, I'll kind of keep you posted on what's going on. So anyway, I would be calling her about every hour. Well, finally it hit about 6 o'clock, and it was just nasty. And so we actually, in fact, the tornado came right up to the med group. In fact, I'd called the med group right before it hit, and this guy in the ER answered the phone. And he said, Captain, I don't have time to talk to you because it's here. And he just dropped the phone. He didn't even hang it up. He just dropped the phone. I could hear it, you know, rattling the windows. And then it jumped across the street, destroyed the neighborhood across the street from the base, missed the med group, jumped back across the street, went up the corner of Tinker, and it was just amazing. So we got recalled. In fact, then the phone lines went out. The TV never did go out. That was amazing to me. The TV didn't go out, but the phone went down. So I was listening on the TV, and they put out a recall for us because none of the phones were working. So the base did a recall. Now you're gonna love this story. So it took, what normally took me 20 minutes to get to base, took me 3 hours to get to Tinker because all the streets were jacked up and there were trees down everywhere and whatever. And none of the lights were working, none of the stoplights were working. So anyway, I finally got this one intersection, and this police officer was working us through, and I pulled up because I had heard that they wanted all the medical personnel to get to the base hospital because that's where I worked, because we had people that were coming in. And so I get there, and the guy, I said, sir, I said, I'm a medic at the hospital, and I was in uniform. He said, well, are you a doctor? Well, I am a doctor of pharmacy. So I said, well, yes, I am. He says, no problem. He said, I'm calling ahead. They will have it cleared for you. You just keep driving. Don't stop. I said, cool. So I took off, and sure enough, man, these police officers, because he told them what vehicles I was driving, they just kept waving me on. You know, it's awesome. I was like, wow, I should say I'm a doctor more often. It's pretty cool. So then I spent the next 3 days at the hospital because, I mean, you couldn't get in and out, and we had patients coming in. In fact, they opened the doors to civilians because they couldn't get to their medical care. So we were filling prescriptions for everybody and their brother. So yeah. So yes, I was in Oklahoma for that big one. Now, interesting thing with Shepherd, because you're right in the Panhandle, and so you're right on the border of Oklahoma and Texas. And oh my gosh, they come through there all the time. But fortunately, I never had one while I was stationed at Shepherd.
So we'll jump back into the timeline of your 2 years, good training, and then where do you go?
So at that point, I'd made major.
And what year is it?
I was at Shepherd from 2001 to 2003. So I made major just before I transferred down there. And then in 2003, I got picked up for lieutenant colonel. But what's interesting about that, actually it was in 2004. In 2003, I got selected for squadron command. And so, and that's, go ahead.
Can you explain that for
yes,
us?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So in the Air Force officer structure, generally your squadron commanders at that point in time were majors or lieutenant colonels, generally. They preferred them to be lieutenant colonels, but they did have majors that were squadron commanders. And a squadron, if you compare it to the Army structure, a squadron would be comparable to either a large company or could even be a regiment, because just depending on the squadron. And I was a squadron commander 5 times. I was a company commander twice on the Army side. So, but squadrons are probably comparable to companies, but also could be comparable to a regiment. It just depends on the size of it. And so at your timeline as an officer goes, generally they start looking at you for squadron command. At that time, they started looking at you as when you were a senior major, and I was a senior major at the time. And so I got picked up for squadron command. What's interesting in the Air Force is it's somewhat of a competitive process. So once you get selected, doesn't mean you're going to get a squadron. Now you have to start going out and politicking, because what you basically have to do is you have to contact the medical groups, and the groups would be comparable in the Army to potentially a very large battalion or small division because of how, again, the structure of the medical group. So you have to contact the medical group commander, and he or she is usually going to be a full colonel. And you basically have to buy and sell yourself to them of why you want to be their squadron commander. Because you would get a list of what squadrons were coming open, and as a pharmacist, what I would be eligible for. And so then you would contact them and you'd say, da 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 da. So I did that, and I got picked up to go to Whiteman, which is in Missouri. So in June of 2003, we picked up and moved to lovely Knob Noster, Missouri, where Whiteman is stationed, and Whiteman's the home of the B-2 bomber.
Did you want to be a squadron?
Yes.
Or? Okay.
Oh yeah, yeah, I wanted to do that. Because again, as you progress, I mean, that's one of the things about the military, as you both well know, it is a progression. You don't want to stay the same. In fact, you have to progress. You have to. And that was a logical step for me. Was because I'd already ran, at that point in time, I already ran 3 pharmacies. I had managed a schoolhouse, so it was a normal progression for me. And the squadron I had, I actually had 2 squadrons at the same base. So my first squadron was the medical support squadron, and the medical support squadron has pharmacy, lab, radiology, resource management, which was kind of cool, because you had a pharmacist in charge of all the money. That's awesome. Which is probably scary. Medical readiness and logistics. So those were my flights within the squadron, and it was really a good experience. It was really great. And then, so you're a squadron commander for 2 years, and then at that time, they would allow you to be considered for a squadron, a second squadron. Air Force has changed that a little bit, but that's not important. So I got picked up for Medical Operations Squadron at the same group, which was really cool. So now I'm in charge. When that changed over, I was in charge of the docks. So I had all the medical practices were mine. And that was really fun because docks, having a pharmacist in charge of the docks, that's kind of a backwards way to look at it. But that was a lot of fun. I really did enjoy that. And I learned a lot because I had my deputy commander was a nurse who was very good. She actually came back after she made 06. She came back to be the group commander at Whiteman, was her last duty there. But that was really, really very, very, it was very interesting, and I learned a lot from that. So, let's see. So you want me to go on?
Yeah, by all means.
So those 2 squadrons, so it really put me in an interesting position because I made lieutenant colonel, of course, while I was there. And when I left Whiteman, they really weren't sure what to do with me because I'd actually been a squadron commander twice, which most of my compatriots, most of my peers had not done that. So they really weren't sure what to do with me because I had almost put myself in a position where I'd gone too far too fast. So they weren't sure what to do with me. So they were looking, so it was time for me to PCS, it was time for me to move. And I couldn't go be another squadron. They weren't going to let me do that, which is fine. So I'm going, okay, where are you going to put me? So they gave me a choice. Well, really they didn't. They never give you a choice. But they said, well, we can send you to Arizona, Davis-Monthan, which is, if you know anything about it, it's the boneyard. That's where we put all of our old planes that we don't use anymore. So I could have gone there. And in fact, I said, okay. So I get down there, and General Jay and I are looking at houses and stuff. And in fact, we're ready to put an offer on one. And I get a call from the Personnel Center, Air Force Personnel Center, and they said, Colonel Johnson, what are you doing? I said, well, we're getting ready to buy a house in Arizona. Don't. I said, well, why? Well, there's a chance you're going to the Air Force Academy. I said, okay, how much of a chance? Well, about 50-50. I said, well, that's a flip of a coin. And he said, well, put it on hold for 24 hours. We'll call you back. I said, okay. So we told our realtor, hang on. And so 24 hours later, they called and said, Colonel Johnson, you're going to the academy. I said, okay. So we told my realtor, and now you'll love this. So we get back to Whiteman, and I say, when am I moving? So, well, you're moving in 90 days. Okay. Well, we don't have a house yet. So anyway, so we'd already used our permissive TDY to go look at houses in Arizona, so they're not going to give me another one. So General Jay went to Colorado Springs by herself. She looked at 20 houses in a day and a half, and she finally found the one she wanted, and she sent it back to me, and I said, okay. And so she came home. We did that all online, and we ended up buying a house. Again, grace of God, because Cindy said, this is all we're paying for the house, and the realtor said they'll never go for that. Submitted the offer and said, accepted. So we were at Colorado Springs. I was the pharmacy flight commander at the academy, and the deputy squadron commander, and it was good duty. I really enjoyed that. So we were there for basically 4 years, and that's where I did my deployment to Afghanistan while I was there. And I made 06 while I was there, so I made full colonel while I was there. So that was good.
You're not just going to jump over a deployment to Afghanistan and not give us some details. Please, sir, please.
Well, that's a great story because my son-in-law, who's also an Air Force pharmacist, he had got deployed from Seymour Johnson, and that was 2000. He actually got tagged. I got tagged to deploy, but I was having some eye surgery done. I had cataracts, and then I had PRK done for my sight. So he got tagged for my deployment in 2009.
Thanks, Dad.
Yeah, thanks, Dad. And so, or 2008. So what's kind of interesting is since he got picked for mine, my eyes got corrected, everything was cool. It was kind of up time for him to be replaced. So I called a very dear friend of mine who happened to be a pharmacist, but he was working in the deployment center. and Lieutenant Colonel Tkach, and I said, Tkach, I said, you need to get me tied into this. I want to do it. I'm volunteering to go. He said, you want to take your son-in-law's place? Yes. And so I replaced my son-in-law. So he took my deployment, and then I replaced him. So that was kind of cool. I was part of the embedded training team in Kandahar. We were working with the Afghan Regional Military Hospital there, KRMH. And our job was to train the Afghan medics. So it was very fascinating work. So we were actually combat advisors. We went to Fort Kelly and did all that, and it was interesting, very, very interesting. So I was there for 10 months, and it's very interesting being deployed. It really is, and especially in a combat zone. It's just different, especially when you're there as an advisor. So you're supporting the effort, but yet you're kind of standing behind the guys that are doing all the fighting. So that was kind of fascinating. But we had some interesting scenarios because we did some mass casualties, some real life mass casualties, because they were the regional hospital for the Afghan army. So if ever there was a mass cash in our area, they came there and we would go and support them. So we did some things that pharmacists don't generally get a chance to do. You know, we could have gone in and done surgery if we wanted to. That was kind of scary. So I didn't do that.
Okay.
But I did do a lot of things that normally a pharmacist wouldn't do. Because our pharmacists, the Afghan pharmacists, really have more of an expanded role than what your average pharmacist does. So they were not only in charge of logistics, but they were also in charge of all the medications. They were starting RVs regularly because they didn't have enough nurses, so the pharmacists would do it. So it was very fascinating work. Glad to be home.
We're happy to have you.
Thank you.
All right, so that ended 2010 maybe?
I've been, yes, 2000, because I was there from July 2009 to January 2010. So yeah, yep. And so then when I got home, it was time, so I came back to the academy. I made 06 in the summer of 2010, and it was time to PCS in that next cycle. So in June 2011, they shipped me off to San Antonio, to Joint Base San Antonio. So I was there at Wilford Hall at Lackland. And I was the pharmacy squadron commander of the only pharmacy squadron in the Air Force. And I was the last pharmacy squadron commander of the only pharmacy squadron in the Air Force, because we merged in 2013, we merged the pharmacy squadron with the lab squadron and the nutritional med squadron.
Which sounds like a great idea.
It does, and in fact it was in line with what was going on in the Air Force, because instead of the pharmacy being its own flight, they were making what they call medical diagnostic therapeutics flights. And although, as you well know, Nick, the Air Force kind of goes back and forth, so it's kind of back to where the pharmacy flight's by itself, but it's combined in a squadron of those units. So. But yeah, that was good duty. I enjoyed that.
So, time to move.
Yes.
3 more years go by.
Yes, and so
How long have you been in now?
At that point, when I PCS'd from Wilford Hall, I'd have been in 22 years. Now, what's really interesting is when I got to Wilford Hall, it had been 20 years since I had gone through Officer Basic at Air Force Officer Basic at Lackland. And so it was really bizarre to now be a squadron commander where I had been a young captain at, and we would go out and do PT at the places I did PT as a captain. And you know, you'd sit there and say to the young airmen, you know, 20 years ago, and they're looking at you, what? I'm not even 20 now, you know. And what's really funny is a lot of those places hadn't changed much. Some of it had, but not much. So yes, so 22 years. So get the lovely Dayton, Ohio, back to Wright Pat.
How's the general feeling?
She's pretty excited about that, because at that point in time, her dad had been having some real health issues, and so she was really wanting to get back in this area anyway. In fact, the last 2 years we were in Texas, she was coming back about every 90 days to try to help take care of her dad, because he just was not doing well. And so getting back here was really important for us.
Did you request it, or
Um,
it worked out?
It kind of, yes, I did. So I was only supposed to be at Wilford Hall for 2 years. And because as an 06, they move you every 2 years, 2 or 3. And so it was time, and I was a squadron commander. So squadron command is generally just 2 years, and they move you on. So as we got ready to go into that 3rd year, there was some challenges going on within the Air Force Manning at the time. So they requested me to stay an additional year. And I said, okay, I'll do that. However, what I want by staying an extra year is to be guaranteed you'll send me to Wright Pat. And they said, well, you know, Colonel, we can't guarantee that. And I said, oh, I think you can. And so we had some discussions about that, and as it worked out, sometimes it's not what you know, it's who you know. There were some individuals that were at Wilford Hall at the time who were going to be in senior leadership positions in the DoD that I got to be good friends with, and they worked with me to ensure I ended up here, and it worked out. Go ahead.
What did you do here?
When I first got here, I was the pharmacy flight commander, and it was an 06 position, and so I was in charge of the pharmacy. I did that for 2 years, and then my last year, we had a situation where one of the squadrons in the med group, the colonel that was in charge of that had some issues and had to be relieved, and so my group commander at the time, it was my corps position, or squadron commander position, asked me if I would fill in for him. And so that was my last year anyway. So I said, yes, but understand, come next June, I'm done. So just be aware of that. So I was the AMDS squadron commander for my last year.
Okay. What a way to go out.
Yeah. Yes. It was an interesting experience.
Okay.
AMDS at the time had some challenges. And so I got to help try to clean those up a little bit and go from there. So, but fortunately, I had a really good crew in the pharmacy and I mentioned Lieutenant Colonel Tkach. He actually was my number 2 when I got here. And so Tkach and I had a really good relationship. We had worked together in several different positions in capacities. So it was really good to have him, and he made a huge difference.
Okay. Great. So I'm sure you had a wonderful retirement party.
I did. It was an awesome, awesome event. My officiating officer was actually my former wing commander at Whiteman, Lieutenant General Miller, and he just did a phenomenal job. And we just had a good time. General Jay was glad when it was over because there was just a lot of moving parts with that. We had a lot of family in town and different things, but it really worked out well. And so, yeah, but we were all glad when it was done.
And so it's done?
Yes.
What do you and the general do now?
We sit at home and drink a lot of coffee. No, that's not it. What we're doing now, Ericka, actually, and you're aware of this, one of the things that we started in my last couple years, and actually it started in Texas, we were very aware as we were getting closer to the end of our career of trying to help veterans get to the resources they need. So we got involved in a volunteer veteran service organization called Operation Pathfinders. And Operation Pathfinders has a mission. They're basically their 5 pillars is called HELPS. And HELPS deals with housing, education, just living in itself, PTSD, and service. And so with those 5 pillars, we really try to work with different resource partners that if a veteran's having issues getting a hold of a resource or getting connected with a resource, we try to help them make those connections. Like the VA is one of our resource partners, and we've got, in fact, Wright State, we've used you guys before. There's several organizations. We have about 95 to 100 resource partners right now that we'll reach out to. And we do different things. Like, for example, I have 2 cases we're working right now where there's a veteran up in Troy, Ohio, who needs a ramp built because they're a wheelchair. They're a Korean War vet. They need a wheelchair ramp built. So we're trying to see if we can't find someone to go out there and build them a ramp. We have another situation in Lima where a veteran has absolutely nothing, and they're getting ready finally to get moved into an apartment, but they have no furniture at all. So we're going to see if we can't reach out and find them some furniture and get them set up those ways. So those are the kind of things that Pathfinders does. And that's really pretty cool. And then I'm very involved in our church. I have my own pharmacy consultant business now, and so I'm doing that. And I get to do probably 90% of that from home, and I really enjoy doing that. And we're working primarily in compounding pharmacy, which is a very interesting area of pharmaceutical care. And so, so I'm doing that. I'm very involved in paintball because I love to play paintball. So I'm on 2 different paintball teams, and so we do that. And then we visit a lot with our family and that kind of stuff. So yes, I have absolutely nothing going on.
Oh, I see. What kind of coffee is it?
Huh?
What kind of coffee are you drinking? That was just
Jolt.
Just
Hazelnut.
okay.
As long.
I had 2 questions.
Yes, sir.
One is you have an interesting career in that you come in as like a doctor, but in listening to your stories, you're more about management. And for the
And Nick, that's a great observation. So, what's interesting in Air Force Pharmacy, and this was a little, although I think Army Pharmacy is somewhat the same now. Your first half of your career is primarily working within the pharmacy, but as you become more of a senior pharmacist, they really start pulling you more into management and especially senior leadership, because as you become a senior lieutenant colonel, part of the expectation is if you want to make it onto that next level is that you will start going into the command track. There's essentially 3 tracks in Air Force Pharmacy. There's the clinical track, which you can make 06 go in that direction, but it's a little more challenging because sometimes you're still going to have to come over to the command side. When I made 06, we were the first 06 class that all of us had been squadron commanders. And so that soon became, you had to become a squadron commander if you wanted to make 06. So I think that's true. I think that's still true today. So your first half of your career, if you're just doing a 20-year career, is pretty much going to be in the pharmacy taking care of that. That second half is going to be a blend of doing that, but also leadership, senior leadership and management. Yeah.
second question, with this being recorded, many viewers, what message do you have for young people that might have a similar route? We think of the Air Force flying, but it's diverse.
First off, you gotta follow your passion. Now, the very, very, very first thing, of course, for me, is my faith, because I know my faith. General Jay and I have often said that we were missionaries, and God just used the Air Force to get us to where He needed us to be. And I believe that to be true. And so I know that as I sit here, that who I am, what I am, and what I do is because of the grace of God, and I understand that. So I think I would encourage young folks to take a hard look at what their faith is. And I won't say religion, because religion and faith are not the same thing. I would say your faith. What's your faith? And then follow your passion, because I'm passionate about pharmacy. I'm passionate about taking care of people. I am a combat medic, and that's, if someone says, you know, that's where the Army gets it right. They'll say, what are you? Well, I'm a soldier. Okay, but what's your job? Well, I'm a combat medic. See, the Air Force doesn't get that. The Air Force will say, well, what are you? Well, I'm a pharmacist. Well, no, you're an Air Force airman first, and then you are what they are. But follow your passion. And I have never been led astray with that, because what I found was things that I've learned in my pharmacy career, I can apply to other things. And things that I've learned elsewhere, I can apply back to pharmacy. And I would say that's why you follow your passion, because your passion won't lead you wrong. And I think then third, and this is probably very cliche, but be true to yourself. You know, be true to who you are. Be true to who your parents raised you to be. And those things that you've learned in your formative years, be true to that. And it won't lead you astray at all. I would say those are the big 3 things.
Have you remained in contact with any of your fellow veterans? I'm sure you have. But any,
Yes.
any-
This is interesting, and Nick, I know with you being prior Air Force, you understand this as well. That brotherhood we have, or sisterhood, whatever the case may be, that familyhood we have as veterans, it goes across so many gradients like General Jay and I have made so many dear friends across the world through the Air Force connection, and that's really cool to have that. I've even got some contacts back with the Army National Guard, and that's really been fun. So 2 years ago, I was invited to speak at the Indiana Army National Guard Officer Candidate School banquet. And so as an Air Force colonel, going into an Army organization that I had belonged to, that was just a hoot, because I got to share some stories with them from what I had experienced in the Army Guard. But that was really, really cool. So, I've had some really good connections. And now part of Hospice at Dayton, I'm one of the American Pride pin recognizers. So one of my jobs, in fact, I'm wearing one right now, as a pin honor, I will go to the veteran who's usually in the hospice system, and which would indicate to us that they're kind of coming to the twilight of their life. And we'll do a pinning. I like to call it, we'll pin on a medal for them, their last medal, for recognizing who they are and what they gave to our country. And that's really, really very, very moving, and it's very rewarding. And I've done about probably 30 pinnings so far in the past year, and it's just amazing. And some of these veteran stories, just you sit there and it rips your heart out to listen to some of these guys have done and stuff. And it's really pretty cool. That's pretty cool. But then, of course, through my business, I'm still connected with my Air Force guys, because we're primarily working within the DoD, but the Air Force right now is our primary area of responsibility that we're working in. But that's been really cool, because I've stayed in contact with a lot of guys through that. Ran into some of my fellow folks that worked with me and for me, and that's been kind of fun. So yeah, I still have a lot of contact with those guys, and that's really cool.
You mentioned organizations, so I just want to run down the list. Dayton of Hospice,
Operation Pathfinders.
Operation Pathfinders.
Right. My church, Engaged City Church, I got to give a shout out to them, because that's cool. VFW, American Legion, actually working with the Huber Heights Council, City Council, working with them. Let's see, there's Habitat for Humanity, work with those guys, work with the American Red Cross. Actually work a lot with the Ohio Veteran Services Department. I work with those folks quite a bit.
Who do you know over there?
Dan Simsel.
Okay.
Yeah, Colonel Dan Simsel, Air Force retired.
Okay.
Yeah, he's a good guy. Let's see, I'm trying to think of some of the, oh my gosh. For Plausibility, have you worked with those guys?
I have not heard of them.
They are down, I always screw this up. Cindy corrects me every time I do it. I want to say they're in Kettering, but that may not be right. But anyway, For Plausibility, great, great group. What they are, they're a group that supplies service dogs and service animals, not only for veterans, but for like autistic children and diabetic individuals and those kind of folks. But they have a heart for veterans. And they really have a very cool campus. If you get a chance to, you should go down and see it. And if you want to, give me a holler. I'll get you a tour.
Okay.
Because it really is awesome. And they actually, they breed the pups, they raise the pups, they train the pups, and they can have up to 500 dogs going at a time. And it's just amazing. And if the dog washes out, they'll get the dog adopted out. So, they make sure that the dog is taken care of in a proper way. And it's just really a great group. So we work with them, work with Honor Flight, both Honor Flight Dayton and Honor Flight Columbus. I'm sitting here trying to think of all the different organizations. My gosh, there's so many of them.
I'm trying to figure out when you have time for coffee.
I have a To-go cup. It's out in the truck right now.
My question was, how do you have time to volunteer for the museum?
Well, that's an interesting question, Nick. So there's actually two different ways you can volunteer. Well, there's actually three, but the two ways you can volunteer that Cindy and I are involved in, you can be a staffer, which is you do a 4-hour shift and you work on the floor. You provide security, essentially.
Hold on, I didn't. Nick,
The
you said-
National Museum of the United States Air Force.
Oh, the Air Force Museum.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to. I don't know
Yeah.
if that was clear. So
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
security.
so the national, yeah.
Okay.
So if you work a normal 4-hour shift, which is either a morning shift or an afternoon shift, you work at the desk, and they usually rotate you around. You either work at the desk or you're rotating through the gallery to make sure security's okay. But you also answer questions as visitors come in, that kind of thing. Then you can be a docent, and a docent is basically a tour guide. And so that's been the way for me, to answer your question, that has become really more effective for me on my time. Because a docent, you're only doing usually 2 hours at a time. Whereas when you're working a 4-hour shift, that 2 hours may not sound like much, but it really, I mean, I get in, I do my tour, and I leave. And it really, I just love it. Because I love history anyway. I've been a military history buff for years. And it's just fascinating to be able to tell the stories. And that's one of the things, that's kind of our motto at the National Museum of the United States Air Force is we are the keepers of the stories. And it's really kind of cool to share those. And you learn something new every day. It's just fascinating. So it's kind of cool, yeah.
Okay. How has your military service impacted your feelings about war and the military in general?
Well, that's a great question.
I try.
Okay. First off, I was raised by a patriot. And I mean, my father, being a Pearl Harbor survivor, he really instilled in me that part of our responsibility as Americans is to support and defend our Constitution and our way of life. And so it really seemed like a natural thing to do that. And during the Vietnam era, I actually, my draft number was 8 when I started at Purdue. And so I thought, sure, I'd probably be drafted before that happened. But then when it got time that it was, I wanted to consider that. So becoming part of the military always just seemed a logical thing for me to do. And it really wasn't much of a hard sell when my banker started kind of trying to recruit me for the Army National Guard. It really wasn't hard for me. Because I had been a Boy Scout, I was an Eagle Scout, and I did all that. And I was pretty excited, you know, because you know the difference between Boy Scouts and the National Guard, right? Yeah, well, National Guard, or Boy Scouts have adult leadership. But anyway, so for the National Guardsmen that are listening to this, that was a joke. And I was a National Guardsman, so I understand. So it just was a natural progression for me to come into the military. And then it really did click. And Cindy can tell you that you could just tell that before I don't want to say I was drifting, but you could just tell I didn't follow my passion. And then when I got in the military, it just really did. I mean, the lights came up on the floor and I just had to follow the lights, and it was really cool.
Okay. Is there anything you feel like we haven't discussed in this interview that you'd like to?
In your second part of your question, you said something about war. So let me go back to that. Maybe you didn't, but I'm going to do that anyway. I think that, you know, one of the things we do with our oath of commission is that we say we'll support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I think that's very important for us. And I think sometimes that, unfortunately, that mission doesn't get translated very well to our civilian compatriots. And so I think sometimes we as the military need to do a better job of trying to translate that. And that's part of what I'm trying to do now, because even once you retire and you hang the uniform up, or you separate and hang the uniform up, we still wear that. We still do. And I think it's important for us to try to help bridge that scenario. So one of the groups I'm involved with is called the Interfaith Bridge, and the Veteran Interfaith Bridge. And that's part of their mission, is to try to help our civilian compatriots have a better understanding of what military service is about and what we do. And not just military service, but also our first responders. Because we've seen in our nation here over the last several years, there's been a lot of challenges for our law enforcement, our firefighters, our EMTs. And I think it's very important that we try to help them bridge that as well. So I think that's part of where, you know, no soldiers, as you guys know, no soldier ever wants to go to war. You never do. But sometimes it's a necessity. And so we're one of that 2% that's willing to raise their hand and do that. Would I go to war again? If the nation needed me, yes, I would. If they called me back to go, I'd go. But that's because that's what we need to do. That's our responsibility. And if I can go and someone else, like my son-in-law, if I can replace him in the battlefield, I'll do it. But that's what we do. And I think we just need to help our civilians understand that a little better. And we don't do that very well. So that's partly what I'm trying to do now.
Okay. Well, keep up the good work.
Thank you.
It seems like
You
you're
as
doing
well.
an amazing job at that. This concludes our interview with Dr. Jeffrey Johnson. Thank you so much for your time today and for your service.
Thank you very much.